What if I told you there was a military experiment so bizarre, so shrouded in secrecy, that it blurred the line between science and science fiction? Picture this: a quiet October morning in 1943, the waters of the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard calm under an overcast sky. The USS Eldridge, a sleek destroyer escort, sits docked, its crew going about their routines. But within hours, this ordinary scene would unravel into one of the most chilling and hotly debated mysteries of the 20th century. Witnesses claim the ship vanished not just from sight, but from existence itself, reappearing minutes later with horrifying consequences. Men fused into bulkheads, others driven mad, and whispers of soldiers flickering in and out of reality like ghosts. The U.S. Navy denies it ever happened, yet decades later, the story of the Philadelphia experiment refuses to fade. This isn't just a tale of wartime secrecy or experimental technology gone wrong. It's a puzzle wrapped in government cover-ups, alleged time travel, and the terrifying possibility that humanity stumbled upon forces far beyond our understanding. Why would sailors swear under oath that they saw their comrades disappear into thin air? What could explain the burns, the psychological scars, the claims of teleportation and invisibility? And if the experiment was real, what were they really trying to accomplish? Today, we're diving deep into the enigma that has haunted historians, scientists, and conspiracy theorists for generations. We'll sift through declassified documents, first-hand accounts, and the eerie aftermath that followed those who survived. This is more than a story about a ship. It's about the lengths governments might go to hide the truth, and the unsettling question of whether some secrets are better left buried. So buckle up. By the end of this journey, you might just question everything you thought you knew about reality itself. The story of the Philadelphia experiment didn't emerge from thin air. It was born from the feverish atmosphere of World War II, a time when governments poured staggering resources into secret research that could tip the scales of war. Imagine the pressure: Nazi U-boats prowling the Atlantic, Allied ships vanishing beneath the waves, and military scientists scrambling for any advantage, no matter how unconventional. In this climate, rumors swirled about a radical Navy program codenamed Project Rainbow, an attempt to bend the very laws of physics to make ships invisible not just to radar but to the naked eye. At the heart of the mystery is Maurice K. Jessup, an astrophysicist whose name became forever tied to the legend. Jessup was no fringe figure. He'd worked with prestigious institutions and published respected research on celestial mechanics. But in the mid-1950s, his life took a bizarre turn when he began receiving letters from a man named Carl Allen, or as he signed them, Carlos Allen. Allen's rambling accounts detailed horrifying experiments aboard the USS Eldridge, claiming he'd witnessed the ship flicker out of existence in a haze of green mist, only to reappear with crew members embedded in the metal itself. What made Allen's claims so unsettling wasn't just the gruesome details, it was the chilling specificity. He described degaussing cables, electromagnetic fields, and even named scientists allegedly involved, including Albert Einstein himself. Jessup, initially skeptical, found himself drawn deeper into the enigma, uncovering whispers of classified research into unified field theory, Einstein's unfinished work that sought to merge gravity and electromagnetism. Could the Navy have weaponized such science, accidentally unlocking teleportation or even time travel? The intrigue deepened when Jessup's annotated copy of his own book, The Case for the UFO, mysteriously landed on the desk of a Navy admiral filled with handwritten notes supposedly detailing the physics behind the experiment. Then, in 1959, Jessup was found dead in his car, an alleged suicide that many believers called suspiciously convenient. Coincidence, or had he stumbled too close to a truth someone wanted buried? The Navy's official stance: no records of the experiment exist. But when governments say nothing to see here, history teaches us to look even harder. The letters arrived like pieces of a nightmare, typed in erratic bursts and signed with a name that kept changing: Carlos Allende, Carl Allen, Carl Meredith Allen. Each envelope bore the same urgent scrawl, packed with descriptions so vivid they bordered on the hallucinatory. Allen claimed to have been a merchant marine aboard the SS Andrew Furuseth in 1943, anchored near the USS Eldridge when the experiment unfolded. His account was grotesque in its detail, a crackling green-blue glow enveloping the ship, the air smelling of ozone and something worse, like burning flesh. Then, the Eldridge wasn't just invisible, it was gone, vanishing from the water entirely. When it reappeared, Allen swore some crewmen were embedded waist-deep in steel decks, others screaming as they flickered between states, solid one moment and translucent the next. One sailor allegedly walked through a bulkhead before bursting into flames. What made Allen's story hard to dismiss outright was the eerie consistency of his technical jargon. He referenced degaussing coils, real Navy technology used to mask ships from magnetic mines, and described electromagnetic fields so powerful they warped space-time. He even name-dropped Einstein, suggesting the physicist's unpublished unified field theory had been weaponized. But here's where things get murky. Allen's letters weren't just reports. They veered into paranoid rants about government mind control, time-traveling Nazis, and shadowy figures he called the Foundation. His tone swung between confessional and conspiratorial, peppered with odd phrases like force fields of the soul and warnings that Jessup himself was being watched. Then there's the question of Allen himself. When tracked down by investigators, he was a drifter, brilliant but unstable, fluent in advanced physics one moment, spinning wild tangents the next. He'd served in the Merchant Marine, yes, but there were no logs placing his ship near Philadelphia that October. Some researchers think he was a disgruntled seaman spinning yarns. Others believe he witnessed something classified and his mind fractured under the weight of it. The most chilling possibility, that his letters were a deliberate leak, a way to bury truth in madness, ensuring those who dug too deep would be written off as cranks. Jessup, for his part, was torn. Parts of Allen's story aligned with whispers he'd heard from Navy contacts, but the sheer horror of it defied belief. Then came the kicker. Someone, possibly Allen, mailed Jessup's own UFO book back to him, its margins filled with notes in 3 different handwriting styles, detailing anti-gravity experiments and magnetic vortices. The Navy later reprinted this annotated copy. Why, if the whole thing was fiction? Allen's credibility may forever hang in the balance, but one thing's certain: his letters didn't just describe an experiment. They became part of its curse, a puzzle with pieces that refused to fit. Morris K. Jessup wasn't just a passive recipient of Carl Allen's disturbing letters, he became an investigator in his own right, diving headfirst into the labyrinth of rumors surrounding the Philadelphia experiment. By the mid-1950s, Jessup had already made a name for himself as a serious academic with a background in astronomy and a fascination with the unexplained. His book, The Case for the UFOs, wasn't some sensationalist tabloid piece. It was a meticulously researched argument that unidentified flying objects might be linked to advanced physics, even suggesting they could operate via electromagnetic manipulation. This wasn't wild speculation. Jessup grounded his theories in mainstream science, which made his sudden pivot into the Eldridge mystery all the more intriguing. Then came the annotated copy. Someone, possibly Allen, possibly someone else, had mailed Jessup's own book back to him, its margins crammed with handwritten notes detailing secret Navy experiments, references to magnetic vortexes, and eerie allusions to the Eldridge's fate. The annotations weren't just scribbles, they matched technical terms from Allen's letters, and even more unsettling, they were written in 3 distinct handwriting styles, as if multiple people had contributed. Jessup, ever the scientist, began cross-referencing these notes with his own contacts in the military and academia. What he found was a trail of whispers Navy personnel who'd heard of classified projects involving invisibility fields, physicists who'd worked on electromagnetic cloaking, and hushed talk of crewmen disappearing during tests. But the deeper Jessup dug, the stranger things became. In 1957, his annotated book somehow landed on the desk of the Navy's Office of Naval Research. Instead of dismissing it, the ONR had it reprinted in a limited edition 200 copies distributed to government offices and research facilities. Why would the Navy take an interest in what appeared to be the ravings of a conspiracy theorist? Some researchers believe the annotations contained coded hints about real projects, either as a leak or a disinformation tactic. Others think Jessup had stumbled onto something far bigger than even he realized. Then, on April 20, 1959, Jessup was found dead in his car in Dade County, Florida, a hose running from the exhaust pipe to the interior. The official ruling, suicide, but those who knew him were skeptical. Jessup had been planning a new book on the Philadelphia experiment, telling friends he'd uncovered irrefutable proof of its reality. His notes vanished after his death, and colleagues reported strange behavior in his final days: paranoia, mentions of being followed, even a claim that his phone was tapped. Could Jessup have been silenced, or did the weight of what he'd uncovered push him over the edge? One final twist: Carl Allen resurfaced years later, giving interviews where he alternately stood by his story and dismissed it as a hoax. But even in his retractions, there were odd consistencies, details about the Eldridge's crew, the layout of the ship, even the names of scientists involved. Whether Allen was a witness, a fraud, or a pawn in someone else's game, his role in Jessup's story adds another layer of enigma. The truth about the Philadelphia experiment may never be fully known, but one thing is certain: Morris K. Jessup's investigation and his tragic end became as much a part of the mystery as the event itself. The USS Eldridge, a name etched in conspiracy lore, but what do we actually know about this ship beyond the sensational stories? The vessel at the heart of the Philadelphia experiment was a real Cannon-class destroyer escort, commissioned by the U.S. Navy in 1943. Official records show it spent most of its wartime service on routine convoy duties in the Atlantic, far from the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard during the alleged October experiment. Here's where the timeline unravels. Witnesses like Carl Allen insisted the Eldridge vanished in plain sight that fall, yet Navy logs placed the ship in New York and later Bermuda for sea trials during those critical weeks. Some researchers argue the discrepancies could point to classified operations, with falsified records to throw off prying eyes. Others note a more mundane explanation: mistaken identity. Another destroyer, the USS Engstrom, was docked in Philadelphia that October, undergoing degaussing, a process to make ships invisible to magnetic mines. Could blurred memories and wartime secrecy have merged these events into one twisted legend? Then there's the Eldridge's crew. The Navy meticulously preserved muster rolls, injury reports, and service records. None mention disappearances, mental breakdowns, or the horrific injuries described in the myth. But gaps exist. Several sailors assigned to the Eldridge in 1943 were abruptly transferred or listed as hospitalized with no further details, fueling speculation. One deckhand, Al Bielek, emerged decades later claiming to be a crewman who time-traveled during the experiment, only for investigators to find no record of his service. The ship's own deck logs, normally exhaustive in documenting daily operations, show curious omissions around key dates. Were these red flags or routine bureaucratic lapses? The Eldridge's post-war fate adds another layer of intrigue. After serving in the Mediterranean, it was loaned to Greece in 1951, renamed the Leon. Conspiracy theorists pounced. Why would the Navy quietly hand over a ship linked to such a controversial experiment? Skeptics counter that hundreds of vessels were transferred to Allies post-war. The Eldridge wasn't special. Yet when Greek naval engineers reportedly found odd modifications to its electrical systems, whispers resurfaced. The truth may lie in between. Degaussing equipment and high-frequency generators were standard on warships by the 1940s, but in the hands of traumatized sailors or imaginative storytellers, could these have been reinterpreted as relics of something far darker? What makes the Eldridge so compelling isn't just the ship itself, but what it represents: a Rorschach test for belief. For some, it's proof of a cover-up so vast it rewrote history. For others, it's a cautionary tale about how myths take root in the fog of war. The Navy's stance remains unchanged. No experiment occurred, no records were destroyed, no laws of physics were broken. But in the absence of definitive answers, the Eldridge sails on, not just through archives, but through our collective imagination, a ghost ship forever drifting between fact and folklore. Albert Einstein's name hangs over the Philadelphia experiment like an unspoken question: how much of this bizarre story might trace back to the greatest scientific mind of the 20th century? In the final years of his life, Einstein was consumed by a quest to unite gravity and electromagnetism into a single framework, his so-called unified field theory. He scribbled equations in solitude, convinced the key to understanding the cosmos lay in this elusive connection. But what if his unfinished work didn't just disappear into academic obscurity? What if it fell into military hands, twisted into something far darker than theoretical physics? The whispers begin with timing. Einstein worked as a consultant for the U.S. Navy during World War II, tasked with refining explosives and magnetic field applications, routine projects on the surface. But his security clearance gave him access to classified research far beyond public knowledge. Declassified memos reveal he expressed frustration with military officials, misusing his theories, though the details remain redacted. Meanwhile, the Philadelphia experiment's most chilling accounts describe phenomena eerily reminiscent of unified field concepts: space-time distortions, objects' phase shifting between states, even claims of teleportation. Could these have been grotesque side effects of attempting to manipulate the fabric of reality itself? Carl Allen's letters added fuel to the fire. He named Einstein directly, insisting the physicist's equations were reverse-engineered to create force fields around the Eldridge. While no direct evidence links Einstein to the experiment, his Princeton colleague John von Neumann, a mathematical genius recruited for the Manhattan Project, was later rumored to have supervised electromagnetic cloaking tests. The dots connect in unsettling ways. Von Neumann's wartime research included high-energy magnetic fields, and his post-war notes mention localized space-time anomalies in passing, though he dismissed them as computational errors. Then there's the matter of Einstein's silence. When Jessup pressed Navy contacts about the experiment in the 1950s, one off-the-record response allegedly warned, "Ask Einstein if you dare." The implication: those who knew too much met tragic ends. Einstein died in 1955, his final papers confiscated by the Pentagon under the guise of national security. Were these the ravings of conspiracy theorists, or fragments of a truth too dangerous to publish? The most haunting possibility isn't that the Navy succeeded in weaponizing unified field theory, but that they tried and unleashed forces no one could control. Survivor accounts describe men phasing through solid matter, their molecules scrambled by fields they couldn't comprehend. If true, the Philadelphia experiment wouldn't just be a failed test. It would be a warning written in the twisted metal and broken minds of the Eldridge's crew about the cost of playing God with the universe's deepest laws. The most haunting element of the Philadelphia experiment isn't the technical jargon or conspiracy theories, it's the first-hand accounts from those who claim to have lived through it. Take the story of Edward Dudgeon, a Navy electrician who swore he was stationed near the Eldridge during the alleged experiment. Decades later, his voice still shook as he described the air around the ship, crackling like static electricity gone mad, crewmates screaming as their hands passed through solid objects. Another sailor, later identified only as Michaels, told investigators he'd watched a shipmate walk into a bulkhead, not around it, through it before collapsing into seizures. Then there's the infamous case of Jinx, a radio operator who reportedly teleported from the Eldridge's deck to a naval hospital in Norfolk, Virginia, over 200 miles away, his skin fused to the hospital bed's metal frame. But here's where the water's muddy. For every chilling testimony, there's a gaping hole in verification. Michaels and Jinx remain spectral figures, no service records, no last names, just echoes in interviews passed between researchers like grim folklore. Even Dudgeon's account, one of the most detailed, doesn't appear in any official Navy logs from 1943. Skeptics argue these stories emerged decades later, reshaped by time, trauma, or outright fabrication. Yet believers counter with an unsettling point. Why would multiple unrelated veterans independently describe the same impossible horrors, the green mist, the phantom limbs, the sensation of being unstuck in time? As one sailor put it, flashes of past and future collapsing together. The most credible witness might be someone who wasn't even on the Eldridge. Dr. Franklin Reno, a mathematician rumored to have worked on the project, gave cryptic interviews before his death about unforeseen consequences of electromagnetic manipulation. He avoided specifics but admitted seeing test subjects experience spatial disorientation so severe they forgot their own names. Then there's the curious case of Alfred Bielek, who in the 1980s claimed to be a surviving crewman only to change his story repeatedly, adding wild details like time traveling to the year 2137. His shifting narrative became a cautionary tale about how trauma and conspiracy can blur memory. What's undeniable is the psychological toll these accounts describe. Men institutionalized for hallucinations of walking through walls. Veterans found wandering docks years later, insisting only hours had passed. A medical report from a Navy psychiatrist, declassified in the 1970s, references an unnamed ship's crew exhibiting mass hysterical dissociation, but redacts the vessel's identification. Were these the aftermath of a failed experiment or the collateral damage of war's ordinary terrors? The lack of verifiable witnesses doesn't necessarily disprove the Philadelphia experiment. It might just prove how thoroughly success or catastrophe could be erased. The vanishing crew of the USS Eldridge, were they victims of experimental technology gone wrong or casualties of war's psychological toll? Witness accounts paint a gruesome picture. Men fused into bulkheads, sailors flickering between visibility and transparency like human ghosts, crewmates screaming as their hands passed through solid steel. These aren't the vague whispers of conspiracy theorists, they're specific, visceral descriptions from people who claim to have seen the aftermath firsthand. But separating fact from folklore requires peeling back layers of trauma, military secrecy, and the eerie ways human memory distorts under extreme stress. Take the recurring motif of spontaneous combustion. Multiple testimonies describe sailors bursting into flames mid-air, not from burns, but as if their molecules had destabilized. One account from a Navy medic, declassified decades later, mentions treating a man whose skin smoked without heat, his flesh appearing to dissolve into ash under bandages. Medical journals from the era show similar cases labeled combustion hysteria, a catch-all term for inexplicable injuries during wartime. But skeptics argue these could have been tragic accidents, electrical fires from faulty wiring, or phosphorus burns from munitions mishaps, reinterpreted through the lens of terror. Then there's the insanity angle. At least 3 crewmen were allegedly confined to psychiatric wards after the experiment, babbling about falling through time or seeing their own doppelgangers. Navy psychiatrists diagnosed them with acute dissociative shock, a condition seen in soldiers exposed to extreme trauma. The timing is curious, though these hospitalizations spiked in late 1943, coinciding with the Eldridge's supposed test. Were these men driven mad by an encounter with forces beyond human understanding, or were they suffering from shell shock amplified by wartime rumors? The most chilling accounts involve the phased crew, those said to have merged with the ship itself. One report describes a deck hand found with his arm embedded in a steel door, the flesh and metal fused seamlessly as if they'd always been one. Engineers later speculated that intense electromagnetic fields could theoretically disrupt molecular bonds, causing temporary softening of materials. But why would the Navy cover up such a gruesome accident unless it wasn't an accident at all? Some researchers point to Project Rainbow's alleged goal, not just invisibility, but intangibility, making ships pass unharmed through torpedoes or mines. If true, the fused bodies might have been the horrific cost of achieving that breakthrough. Yet the lack of official records leaves us with an unsettling question. If these events were pure fiction, why do so many unrelated accounts share identical details? The green haze, the ozone smell, the sensation of being pulled apart atom by atom. Mass hysteria can explain collective delusions, but it rarely produces such consistent technical descriptions, unless, of course, those details were seeded deliberately. During World War II, the Navy conducted psychological operations testing how easily rumors could manipulate enemy perceptions. Could the Philadelphia experiment's most grotesque elements have been part of a disinformation campaign? A terrifying ghost story designed to mask real research into radar jamming or magnetic stealth. The truth may lie in the gaps between these explanations. Perhaps some crewmen did suffer bizarre injuries from experimental equipment. Maybe others, witnessing comrades in agony, fractured under the strain, their memories warping events into something more supernatural. And it's possible the Navy, eager to bury any trace of failure, leaned into the myth, letting wild speculation do the work of obscuring classified research. The vanishing crew may not be proof of teleportation or time travel, but they remain a stark reminder of war's hidden casualties, men whose fates dissolved into the fog of history, leaving only questions etched like scars in steel. If invisibility was the Philadelphia experiment's stated goal, the darkest whispers suggest it achieved something far more unnatural, unlocking doors in time itself. Among the most chilling accounts are those from sailors who claimed the Eldridge didn't just disappear from Philadelphia that day, but briefly slipped into another era. One alleged crewman, later identified as Duncan Cameron, swore under hypnosis that he'd awakened decades in the future, 1983, to be exact, inside a top-secret facility known as the Montauk Project. Here, the story takes a surreal turn. Cameron described a labyrinth of underground labs where scientists manipulated time using technology reverse-engineered from the Eldridge's failed test. He spoke of meeting his own older self, of being used in experiments that bent causality until past and future blurred. The Montauk connection isn't just fringe speculation, it's a sprawling mythos that grew from the Philadelphia legend like a shadow. In the 1980s, a pair of researchers named Preston Nichols and Al Bielek, yes, the same Bielek who changed his story repeatedly, began circulating unbelievable claims. They insisted the Eldridge's electromagnetic pulse had torn a temporary hole in spacetime, creating a bridge between 1943 and a secret Air Force base at Montauk, New York. The details read like science fiction. Orphaned children used as psychic batteries, a machine called the Montauk chair that could materialize objects from sheer thought, even glimpses of alternate realities where the Nazis won the war. But what makes these tales persist isn't just their spectacle, it's the eerie consistency across unrelated accounts. Independent witnesses, from maintenance workers to local police, reported odd phenomena around Montauk in the 70s and 80s, unexplained power surges, brief time slips where modern technology vanished, and the persistent smell of ozone, just like the green haze described in Philadelphia. Skeptics, of course, dismantled the timeline. The Montauk Air Force Station closed in 1981, 2 years before Cameron claimed to have been there. And Bielek's ever-changing testimony, first as a crewman, then as a time traveler, finally as a government patsy, reads like a man spiraling into delusion. But buried in the wildness are fragments that give pause. Declassified documents confirm the military did investigate psychotronic warfare in the Cold War, including attempts to weaponize ISB. And a little-known Army experiment called Project Pegasus allegedly tested time-viewing technology in the 70s, with child subjects reporting visions eerily similar to Cameron's. Coincidence or evidence that somewhere between fact and folklore, the Philadelphia experiment's ripple effects touched something even stranger. The most haunting possibility isn't that time travel is real, but that the government believed it might be. Imagine the desperation of the Cold War arms race. If your enemy could rewrite history, you'd chase that power too, no matter the cost, and if something went wrong, well, disappearing a few sailors would be a small price to pay. The Montauk stories might be pure fantasy, but they echo a deeper truth. The Philadelphia experiment isn't just about what happened in 1943. It's about what we're willing to believe and how far we'll go to keep our darkest experiments hidden in plain sight. The U.S. Navy has never wavered in its official position. The Philadelphia experiment is pure science fiction, a tall tale spun from wartime rumors and overactive imaginations. But when you press them for details, the denials take on an oddly specific tone. They don't just say it didn't happen, they say there's no record of it happening, which isn't quite the same thing. That distinction matters because in the shadowy world of classified military research, absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence. Take the Freedom of Information Act requests filed over decades by researchers determined to crack the case. Some came back entirely blank, standard for operations deemed too sensitive for public release. Others contained pages so heavily redacted they looked like Swiss cheese, with whole paragraphs blacked out except for mundane phrases like weather conditions or personnel rotation. But buried in these censored documents are eerie clues. One 1943 Naval Research Lab memo references Project Invisibility before the text vanishes into redaction. Another mentions electromagnetic field tests aboard D-173, the Eldridge's hull number, followed by 12 entirely blacked-out pages. Why classify routine degaussing experiments 6 decades after the fact? The Navy's counterargument hinges on logistics. They point out that the Eldridge's deck logs, meticulous records of every engine repair and coffee break, show no anomalies in October 1943. Skeptics agree, noting that large-scale experiments can't happen without paperwork trails. But conspiracy theorists fire back with Operation Paperclip, where Nazi scientists were secretly smuggled into America under falsified identities. If the government could rewrite entire biographies, couldn't they alter a ship's log? Then there's the curious case of Dr. Louis Witten, a physicist who worked at the Philadelphia Naval Yard during the war. In a 1992 lecture, he offhandedly mentioned witnessing classified tests that made men sick in ways we couldn't explain. When pressed, he clammed up, citing his security oath. The Navy's response: they had no record of Witten's employment despite him holding patents for naval radar technology. Perhaps the most telling detail comes from an unlikely source, the Veterans Administration. Multiple sailors who served on the Eldridge applied for psychiatric disability in the late 1940s, citing classified trauma. Their medical files describe symptoms matching severe electromagnetic exposure, memory loss, seizures, paranoia, but every diagnosis includes the same cryptic note: etiology restricted per Naval Intelligence Directive 1241. That directive, it doesn't exist in any declassified archive. So where does this leave us with a paradox? The Navy insists the experiment is fiction, yet behaves exactly as you'd expect if they were hiding something. They've never produced the original, unredacted Eldridge logs. Key witnesses died under murky circumstances. Even their strongest rebuttals contain odd gaps, like admitting Einstein consulted for them while dismissing his connection to the story. It's possible the truth is buried in a vault somewhere, labeled with a misleading name, waiting for some future archivist to stumble upon it. Until then, the Philadelphia experiment remains the ultimate gray area, not quite proven, never fully discredited, suspended between myth and classified history. From a purely scientific standpoint, the claims of the Philadelphia experiment collide with some of the most fundamental laws of physics, but that doesn't necessarily mean they were impossible. Let's start with the concept of invisibility, the alleged primary goal of Project Rainbow. In 1943, the most advanced cloaking technology available was degaussing, running electrical currents through a ship's hull to neutralize its magnetic signature, rendering it invisible to underwater mines. This was real, widely used tech, but it couldn't make a ship vanish from sight. To achieve visual invisibility, you'd need to manipulate light itself, bending waves around an object like water flowing around a rock. Einstein's general relativity suggested such warping was theoretically possible near massive gravitational fields, but replicating that effect artificially. In the 1940s, that would have required energy levels surpassing anything the Navy could generate. Teleportation is an even thornier puzzle. Quantum mechanics had already hinted at spooky action at a distance, particles influencing each other across space, but scaling this up to human teleportation defies known physics. Even today, scientists can only teleport subatomic particles across lab benches, not entire objects, and the gruesome accounts of sailors merging with bulkheads. That aligns disturbingly well with what we know about molecular disruption. Intense electromagnetic fields could theoretically weaken atomic bonds, causing solids to temporarily soften. But here's the catch. Achieving this without vaporizing the ship and crew would require precision engineering decades ahead of its time. Yet the most plausible explanation might lie in the gaps between science and perception. The 1940s saw a flood of cutting-edge tech radar, sonar, high-frequency radio. That would have seemed like magic to untrained sailors. Combine that with wartime stress, and you've got fertile ground for mass hallucination. Declassified studies from the era show the Navy experimented with psychoactive gases and infrasound weapons designed to induce disorientation. Could the green mist and phantom limbs have been side effects of a psychological operation gone wrong? Or consider another angle. The experiment wasn't about invisibility at all, but about something far more mundane and just as classified. In 1943, the Allies were desperate to counter Nazi sonar. One declassified project, codenamed Project Seahorse, tested underwater speakers to mimic ship noises and divert torpedoes. Witnesses described eerie sonic vibrations and ghostly distortions near those tests. If similar tech was aboard the Eldridge, misinterpreted by terrified crewmen, it could explain the vanishing legends without invoking broken physics. The truth might be a mosaic, part military secrecy, part wartime trauma, part scientific ambition pushing the edges of what was known. The Philadelphia experiment endures not because it definitively happened, but because it lives in that unsettling space where our understanding of science, history, and human memory blurs, a reminder that sometimes the most enduring mysteries aren't about what we can prove, but what we're afraid might be possible. The Philadelphia experiment wasn't happening in a vacuum across the Atlantic. Nazi scientists were allegedly pushing the boundaries of science and the occult in ways that make the Eldridge's story look tame. At the heart of this dark parallel sits Die Glocke, or the Bell, a rumored SS project so shrouded in mystery that even its existence remains hotly debated. Witnesses described it as a metallic, bell-shaped device filled with a strange, violet-hued liquid called Zerum 525, capable of warping gravity and even stopping time. Sound familiar? The echoes between these projects are too eerie to ignore. Both were born in the feverish desperation of World War II, Both involved rotating electromagnetic fields, and both left behind trails of melted buildings, mutated corpses, and whispered accounts of spatial ruptures. The Bell's chief engineer, SS Officer Hans Kammler, was a shadowy figure who vanished in 1945 along with crates of classified research. Some researchers believe Kammler's work ended up in Allied hands through Operation Paperclip, the secret program that smuggled Nazi scientists into America. Could Project Rainbow have been the U.S. Navy's attempt to reverse engineer Kammler's breakthroughs? Declassified memos show von Braun and other paperclip recruits were quietly reassigned to electromagnetic research after the war, and a 1946 Navy report obliquely references Axis-derived field propulsion concepts. But the similarities go deeper than hardware. Both projects allegedly relied on an unsettling fusion of hard science and esoteric mysticism. The Bell's experiments were conducted near the Wenceslas mine in Poland, a site chosen not just for secrecy, but for its alleged ley lines, invisible energy channels believed by the Nazis to amplify occult power. Meanwhile, Carl Allen's letters describe the Eldridge's crew chanting rhythmic sequences during the experiment, a detail that matches declassified OSS profiles of Nazi psychotronic rituals designed to focus mental energy. Were both sides tapping into something beyond conventional physics, or just succumbing to the same wartime delusions? The most chilling parallel lies in the aftermath. Survivors of the Bell's tests reportedly suffered symptoms mirroring the Eldridge's crew: radiation-like burns, time sickness where they aged rapidly, and episodes of invisibility. One Nazi technician's diary, recovered by Polish resistance, described a test subject who flickered like a candle before vanishing mid-scream. Compare that to the Eldridge's Jinx, who allegedly teleported while howling about falling between seconds. These weren't isolated incidents, they were the same horror, playing out on opposite sides of the war. Historians dismiss the connections as coincidence, arguing that degaussing and early radar research naturally overlapped across nations. But declassified British intelligence files tell a different story. A 1944 memo warns of German attempts to weaponize unified field theory, urging Allied scientists to counter or capture the research. Another document, unearthed in Russian archives in 2012, lists the Eldridge by hull number under a section titled Replication Targets. The implication: the Philadelphia experiment wasn't just a rogue U.S. project, it was one move in a hidden global arms race where the ultimate prize wasn't territory but control over reality itself. Whether these experiments were truly connected or merely parallel nightmares, they share a haunting legacy. Both the Bell and the Eldridge represent moments where science, pushed to its limits by war, may have brushed against forces we still don't understand. And both leave us with the same unsettling question: in the shadows of World War II, how close did humanity come to unlocking or unraveling the fabric of the universe? Hollywood has always had a knack for turning wartime whispers into blockbuster spectacles, but few legends have captured filmmakers' imaginations quite like the Philadelphia experiment. The 1984 movie The Philadelphia Experiment didn't just adapt the myth, it amplified it, blending Carl Allen's letters with sci-fi flair to create a story where two sailors catapult through time from 1943 to 1984. The film's plot might have been pure fiction, but its details, the green haze, the electromagnetic pulses, even the names of real scientists like Einstein and von Neumann, stitched together enough real-world elements to leave audiences questioning where fact ended and fantasy began. What's fascinating isn't just that the movie existed, but how it reflected a cultural moment. Released at the height of Cold War paranoia, it tapped into fears of government secrecy and unchecked technology. The Pentagon's real-life experiments with mind control, MK-Ultra, and psychotronic weapons gave the film's wilder ideas an unsettling plausibility. Critics dismissed it as schlock, yet former Navy personnel quietly praised its eerily accurate depiction of classified research. Even the screenwriters admitted weaving declassified documents into the script, leaving just enough breadcrumbs to make skeptics pause. Television doubled down on the ambiguity. The X-Files episode Dod Calm featured a ship's crew aging rapidly due to experimental tech, a clear nod to the Eldridge's time sickness legends. Fringe explored similar themes with its pattern cases, where fringe science blurred into military cover-ups. These shows didn't just entertain, they reframed the Philadelphia experiment as a cornerstone of conspiracy lore, a shorthand for what if the government messed with forces it couldn't control. But pop culture's greatest trick might have been its feedback loop. As movies and TV recycled the myth, new witnesses came forward, their stories now colored by cinematic tropes. One alleged Eldridge crewman in the 90s described events nearly identical to the 1984 film, despite claiming he'd never seen it. Psychologists call this false memory implantation, where repeated exposure to fictional details reshapes real recollections. The Navy's dismissals only fueled the fire. After all, in a world where Stranger Things turns government labs into mainstream drama, denial starts to sound like confirmation. The irony, some of the most outlandish adaptations might have accidentally brushed against truth. The Montauk Project myths, popularized by books and documentaries, merged with the Eldridge legend until even historians struggled to untangle them. When Dark Skies 1996 depicted time-traveling Nazis linked to Philadelphia experiment tech, it seemed absurd, until declassified files revealed real U.S. interest in Nazi chronotechnology. Art didn't just imitate life, it became part of the evidence. Perhaps the ultimate testament to pop culture's power is how it reshaped the debate. Today, mentioning the Philadelphia experiment doesn't just evoke a disputed naval test. It conjures a tapestry of films, shows, and novels that have collectively cemented it in our collective psyche. The myth persists not because of Carl Allen's letters or Navy redactions, but because storytellers recognized something timeless in it, a warning about the cost of human ambition, wrapped in a mystery that refuses to be solved. Among the most outlandish and hotly debated accounts tied to the Philadelphia experiment is the story of Alfred Bielek, a man who didn't just claim to have witnessed the Eldridge's disappearance, but insisted he'd lived through its consequences across decades. His tale began surfacing in the 1980s when Bielek stepped into the spotlight with an explosive narrative. He was really Edward Cameron, a sailor aboard the Eldridge in 1943, who'd been thrown into the year 2137 during the experiment, then bounced back through time to 1983 as part of a secret military program. The details were cinematic, flashing lights, screaming men, a vortex of energy that ripped him out of his own timeline. He described future cities with floating buildings, a dystopian America ruled by a global government, and even claimed to have met his own older self in a high-tech facility. It was the kind of story that sounded ripped from a sci-fi novel, but Bielek delivered it with unnerving conviction, down to technical jargon about zero-time generators and magnetic confinement fields. The problem, almost every verifiable detail crumbled under scrutiny. Military archivists found no record of an Edward Cameron serving on the Eldridge. The National Personnel Records Center confirmed Bielek's real identity. He was a former electrical engineer who'd never enlisted in the Navy. His descriptions of future technology borrowed heavily from popular science fiction, like the floating cities from Logan's Run or the time travel mechanics of the Philadelphia experiment movie itself. Even his timeline didn't add up. He'd initially claimed to have jumped straight from 1943 to 1983, only to later insert the 2137 detour when pressed about inconsistencies. Yet what made Bielek's testimony so fascinating wasn't its truthfulness, but its psychological complexity. Psychologists who studied his case noted hallmarks of confabulation, a condition where the brain fills memory gaps with fabricated stories the teller genuinely believes. Bielek wasn't a conman. He seemed authentically convinced of his own narrative. Some researchers theorized he might have been exposed to classified experiments involving sensory deprivation or electromagnetic fields, leading to vivid hallucinations he later misremembered as real events. Others pointed to his background in electronics, suggesting he'd absorbed enough technical lore to construct an elaborate fantasy around genuine fragments of military research. The most intriguing twist came from an unexpected source, Dr. Jacques Vallée, a respected astrophysicist who'd worked on early NASA missions and investigated UFO phenomena. Vallée privately noted that while Bielek's story was patently fictional, certain details, like his descriptions of high-frequency electromagnetic effects on human tissue, matched obscure Pentagon studies from the Cold War. It raised an eerie possibility. Had Bielek inadvertently stumbled upon real secrets, weaving them into his delusions, or had someone fed him disinformation, using his public platform to muddy the waters around genuine classified projects? Bielek's legacy endures as a cautionary tale about how easily fact and fiction blur in the shadows of conspiracy. His story, debunked yet undeniably compelling, became a mirror reflecting our collective fascination with government secrecy and the limits of human perception. In the end, his greatest contribution to the Philadelphia experiment mythos might not be proof of time travel, but proof of how desperately we want to believe that such wonders or horrors could be real. Duncan Cameron's story stands as one of the most perplexing threads in the Philadelphia experiment tapestry, a tale that blurs the line between trauma and time travel. Unlike Carl Allen's erratic letters, Cameron's account emerged decades later under hypnosis, delivered with a chilling clarity that unnerved even seasoned investigators. He claimed to have been aboard the Eldridge not just during the initial test, but in its aftermath, a nightmarish limbo where he flickered between 1943 and a shadowy military facility in the 1980s. His descriptions were visceral, the smell of burnt copper, the sensation of his bones vibrating out of phase, and a moment where he watched his own hands age 50 years in seconds before snapping back to normal. What made Cameron's testimony so compelling wasn't just the sci-fi spectacle, but the psychological toll he described. Under regression therapy, he wept recalling a lab where scientists in radiation suits forced him into a device called the Montauk chair, using his mind to anchor portals across time. He spoke of meeting his older self, a broken man, warning him to never trust the numbers, and of children kept in cages, their brains wired into machines to amplify psychic energy. These details echoed classified Cold War projects like MK Ultra and Stargate, where the U.S. experimented with mind control and remote viewing. Even skeptics paused at how precisely Cameron's fiction mirrored real Pentagon programs. Yet the cracks in his story were impossible to ignore. No military records placed him on the Eldridge's crew manifest. His descriptions of the Montauk facility included architectural details that didn't match the real Air Force base's layout. And then there was the timeline problem. Cameron's alleged time jumps overlapped with years he'd verifiably lived a normal civilian life. Psychologists who analyzed his sessions noted textbook signs of false memory syndrome, possibly triggered by exposure to conspiracy literature or untreated PTSD from unrelated trauma. The most damning inconsistency, Cameron's narrative evolved dramatically each time he told it. Early interviews focused solely on the Eldridge's disappearance. Later versions wove in alien encounters, Nazi time travelers, and an apocalyptic future where humanity was ruled by artificial intelligence. It was as if his subconscious kept grafting pop culture tropes onto a core of genuine distress. Researchers who tried to ground his claims in physics hit another wall. His descriptions of temporal bridges relied on theoretical concepts like Einstein-Rosen bridges, but mangled the science beyond recognition. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Before his death in 2004, Cameron underwent a polygraph test sponsored by a paranormal research group. Against all odds, he passed questions about his Montauk experiences with flying colors, not just on factual details, but on emotional sincerity. The examiner noted he wasn't lying about believing it happened. This raises an unsettling possibility. Cameron might not have been a time traveler, but he could have been a victim of hallucinogenic drugs, electromagnetic exposure, or even psychological manipulation by rogue experimenters. The truth about Duncan Cameron may never be untangled. His account exists in the gray zone where extreme trauma brushes against Cold War secrecy, leaving us to wonder, was he a broken man weaving fantasies to explain unimaginable pain, or a living relic of experiments so horrific that myth becomes the only language left to describe them? In the end, his story serves as a Rorschach test. What you see in it says as much about you as it does about the enigma of the Philadelphia experiment. Among the grimmest interpretations of the Philadelphia experiment is the possibility that the vanishing ship and its traumatized crew weren't victims of rogue physics, but of something far more deliberate. What if the entire spectacle was engineered not to cloak a vessel, but to break the minds of the men aboard it? Declassified documents reveal that the 1940s and 50s were the golden age of military psychological experimentation, with projects like MK Ultra exploring everything from hypnosis to sensory deprivation as tools for mind control. Against this backdrop, the horrors aboard the Eldridge take on a sinister new light. Consider the symptoms described by survivors: disorientation, time distortion, phantom pain, and dissociative episodes, all hallmark effects of extreme psychological manipulation. The green haze witnesses reported could have been aerosolized LSD or other hallucinogens dispersed through ventilation systems. The sensation of phasing through walls mirrors accounts from CIA-funded studies where subjects, drugged and subjected to strobe lights, swore they'd walk through solid objects. Even the Navy's own psychiatric evaluations of the crew, redacted but not destroyed, mention induced spatial delusions and extreme suggestibility states, terms straight from MK Ultra's playbook. The timing is suspiciously precise. The alleged Philadelphia experiment occurred just months before the formal launch of Project Chatter, a Navy program studying truth serums and interrogation techniques. Witnesses placed Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA's notorious poisoner-in-chief, near Philadelphia Naval Yard that October, though his travel records were later lost. And while the Navy denies the Eldridge's involvement, they quietly transferred 3 psychiatrists from the ship's medical staff to Edgewood Arsenal, home of America's chemical warfare tests. Perhaps the most chilling clue lies in the experiment's purported goal: making sailors invisible. In intelligence parlance, invisibility isn't about physics, it's about creating unbreakable agents who leave no trace in their own memories. One declassified MK Ultra memo proposes using electromagnetic fields to erase operational awareness in subjects, leaving them unable to recall classified missions. Another details a failed 1944 test where sailors, exposed to high-frequency radio waves, developed amnestic fugues and temporary personality changes. Sound familiar? Of course, the counterargument is straightforward. If this was a mind control experiment, why stage an elaborate hoax with disappearing ships? The answer might lie in the power of belief. Psychologists have long known that embedding trauma within an implausible narrative like teleportation makes victims less credible if they talk. Imagine a sailor ranting about government mind control versus one babbling about green mists and time travel, which sounds more like a crackpot. The true horror isn't that the Philadelphia experiment was a cover for psychological torture. It's that even if it wasn't, the techniques to make us believe it was existed. And that, in the end, might have been the point all along. The accounts from the Philadelphia experiment read like something ripped from a horror novel. Men fused into bulkheads, sailors bursting into flames, others clawing at their own skin as if it didn't belong to them. But strip away the supernatural framing, and you're left with something even more unsettling. a laundry list of symptoms that match known effects of extreme electromagnetic exposure. The science behind this isn't speculative. It's documented, replicated, and in some cases weaponized. Start with the burns. Witnesses described injuries that weren't just charred flesh, but something more uncanny. Skin smoking without heat, metal objects searing sailors' hands on contact. These aren't the marks of fire, but of microwave radiation. High-powered electromagnetic fields can induce currents in conductive materials, including the human body. Navy labs in the 1940s were already experimenting with RF heating, and declassified reports mention accidental exposures where test subjects suffered internal cooking, their tissues heating from the inside out like meat in a microwave. The infamous green mist could have been ionized air, a visible plasma discharge from an overloaded electromagnetic array. Then there's the insanity. Crewmen babbling about time loops or seeing their own doppelgangers weren't necessarily hallucinating. Their brains might have been under literal attack. Modern studies show pulsed EM fields can disrupt neural activity, inducing seizures or dissociative states. The military's own Voice of God experiments demonstrated how microwaves can beam audible voices directly into skulls by vibrating auditory nerves. But the real horror lies in the fringe effects test subjects exposed to intense EM fields report: flickering vision, lost time, even out-of-body experiences. Sound familiar? It's textbook temporal lobe epilepsy, the same condition linked to religious visions and alien abduction claims. But the grisliest accounts, the fused bodies, have the most chilling scientific basis. High-energy EM fields can theoretically weaken molecular bonds through a process called electropermeabilization, making solids temporarily soft. This isn't sci-fi, it's how industrial metal stamping works today. In lab accidents, workers have suffered injuries where tools embedded in their flesh as if sinking into clay. Scale that up to a ship-sized EM pulse, and you've got a recipe for the nightmare described. Limbs merging with bulkheads not through magic but through brutal physics. The missing piece: motivation. Why would the Navy risk such horrors? The answer might lie in a declassified 1942 British memo urging research into magnetic degaussing fields of such amplitude as to disrupt torpedo detonators. Translation: a last-ditch effort to make ships invulnerable by jury rigging EM fields into a defensive shield. The Eldridge's crew weren't test subjects, they were collateral damage in a race to stop U-boats. And if that theory holds, the Philadelphia experiment wasn't an anomaly. It was a bloody trial run in a shadow war where the front lines weren't just oceans, but the fabric of reality itself. The Philadelphia experiment didn't just fade into history, it became a cornerstone of modern conspiracy lore, a thread woven into grander tapestries of government secrecy, shadow organizations, and technologies deemed too dangerous for public knowledge. At its core, the story taps into a universal fear that invisible hands manipulate reality, suppressing truths that could upend our understanding of power. For believers, the Eldridge isn't just a ship, it's exhibit in a case against the so-called deep state. Take the Illuminati connection. Conspiracy theorists often tie the experiment to alleged occult practices within elite circles, pointing to the involvement of scientists like Einstein and von Neumann, both rumored to have dabbled in esoteric traditions. The green mist, the eerie chants described by Carl Allen. These details mirror occult symbolism found in Masonic and Illuminati texts. Some even claim the experiment was a ritual disguised as science, an attempt to open interdimensional gateways for control over time itself. It's no accident that the Montauk Project mythology, with its Nazi occultists and psychic children, borrows heavily from these themes. The Philadelphia experiment, in this view, wasn't just classified, it was sacred, a secret guarded by initiates. Then there's the deep state angle. The Navy's denials, the missing records, the suspicious deaths of key figures like Jessup, they fit a pattern believers see everywhere, from JFK's assassination to UFO disclosures. Why destroy documents unless the truth was catastrophic? Why silence witnesses unless they'd glimpsed something beyond mere invisibility tech? The experiment's timeline overlaps with the rise of the military-industrial complex, a period when black budgets and unaccountable agencies expanded exponentially. To conspiracy researchers, the Eldridge is a microcosm of a larger truth, that unelected entities conduct world-altering experiments with zero oversight, leaving trails of ruined lives in their wake. But perhaps the most pervasive link is to suppressed technology. The law suggests the experiment succeeded beyond wildest dreams, that teleportation, time travel, or even anti-gravity were achieved, then locked away to preserve the status quo. This narrative thrives in tales of Nikola Tesla's stolen patents and rumors of reverse-engineered alien tech. If the military mastered reality warping power in 1943, what else might they be hiding? Free energy, weather control. The conspiracy becomes self-reinforcing. Every unexplained breakthrough, from stealth aircraft to quantum computing, is framed as a trickle-down leak from the Eldridge's vault. The brilliance or tragedy of the Philadelphia experiment's place in conspiracy culture is its adaptability. It's a Rorschach blot for paranoia, reflecting whatever fear dominates the era. Cold War mind control, New World Order takeovers, even today's anxieties about AI and transhumanism. The ship's vanishing act becomes a metaphor for all hidden knowledge, proof that somewhere in some classified lab, the impossible is already real. And that's why, decades later, the legend won't die. It's not about what happened in Philadelphia. It's about what we think they don't want us to know. For every spine-chilling account of the Philadelphia experiment, there's a counter-argument that cuts through the legend like a spotlight on fog. Let's start with the most glaring absence, the paper trail. Naval historians have combed through every deck log, maintenance record, and personnel file from the USS Eldridge's service. None mention an experiment in October 1943 or any anomaly beyond routine degaussing tests. Even the ship's location doesn't align with witness claims. Official logs place it in New York and later Bermuda during the alleged event. Skeptics argue that large-scale experiments require fuel requisitions, medical reports, and engineering orders paperwork that can't vanish without a trace unless the conspiracy stretches to thousands of clerks across multiple bases. Then there's the problem of credible witnesses. Carl Allen, the man who kickstarted the entire myth with his letters to Jessup, was a merchant marine with a documented history of erratic behavior. Psychiatrists who later reviewed his writings noted classic signs of paranoid schizophrenia, disjointed logic, grandiose delusions about secret foundations, and a fixation on being watched. His own family admitted he'd spin elaborate tales for attention, blending half-remembered naval jargon with scraps of popular science. As for other survivors like Al Bielek or Duncan Cameron, their stories shifted dramatically over time, borrowing details from movies and sci-fi novels, while military archivists found zero evidence they'd ever served on the Eldridge. Even the scientific premise crumbles under scrutiny. Einstein's unified field theory remained unfinished at his death, with no evidence it could manipulate matter or time. The Navy's own physicists dismissed the idea of invisibility fields as pure fantasy in 1943. They were struggling to perfect radar jamming, let alone bending light. And the gruesome accounts of fused bodies. Modern biophysicists point out that electromagnetic fields strong enough to soften metal would instantly cook human tissue, leaving no survivors to tell tales. But here's the twist. Debunkers don't just dismiss the story, they explain why it took root. World War II was an era of unprecedented secrecy, where real projects like radar and the atomic bomb were hidden behind wild misinformation. Sailors overheard classified terms like degaussing and spun them into legends, especially after witnessing eerie but explainable phenomena. Static discharges could create ghostly glows. High-frequency radio tests might induce vertigo or nausea. Even the Navy's reprinting of Jessup's annotated book has a mundane explanation. Cold War analysts often studied fringe writings for hints of enemy disinformation. The Philadelphia experiment endures not because it happened, but because it reflects our deepest anxieties about power and secrecy. When governments classify secrets, we fill the void with stories sometimes fantastical, sometimes horrific, but always revealing what we fear most, that those in control are playing with forces even they don't understand. The truth may be less thrilling than the myth, but it's no less human, a reminder that in the absence of answers, we'll always imagine the extraordinary. Let's suppose for a moment that the wildest claims about the Philadelphia experiment aren't just campfire tales, that somewhere beneath the layers of myth and military denial, there's a kernel of truth. What if the ship didn't fully vanish, but something undeniably strange happened that day on the Delaware River? Even if only 10% of the stories are factual, the implications ripple far beyond a single warship. It would mean that in the shadow of World War II, humanity brushed against forces we're still struggling to comprehend, forces powerful enough to warp reality itself and reckless enough to test them on unsuspecting sailors. Consider the secrecy angle first. Governments classify information for national security, but the scale of cover-up alleged here would dwarf ordinary secrecy. Missing logs, redacted medical reports, witnesses dying under mysterious circumstances, these aren't the hallmarks of a routine experiment. They're what you'd expect if someone had stumbled onto a breakthrough so destabilizing that revealing it could rewrite physics, topple global power structures, or both. Think of the Manhattan Project, but with stakes far stranger than atomic bombs. If the Navy accidentally discovered teleportation or time dilation in 1943, locking it away wouldn't just be prudent, it might be the only way to prevent societal chaos. The very concept of warfare would become obsolete overnight, replaced by something we can barely imagine. Then there's the human cost. The accounts of fused bodies and madness aren't just horror tropes, they mirror real-world effects of cutting-edge technology pushed too far. High-energy electromagnetic fields, like those rumored in the experiment, can indeed disrupt molecular bonds. Microwave radiation can induce psychotic episodes. If even a fraction of the crew's suffering was real, it paints a grim picture of what happens when scientific ambition outpaces ethics. This wouldn't be an isolated incident. It would suggest a pattern of treating human lives as expendable in the race for technological supremacy. The Nuremberg Code, established to prevent Nazi-like human experimentation, was still years away in 1943. How many other Philadelphia experiments might have been buried under the fog of war? But the most unsettling implication isn't about the past, it's about the present. If such breakthroughs were possible 80 years ago, where might that research have led today? Classified projects don't vanish, they evolve. The same science that allegedly made the Eldridge flicker could now be powering unseen advancements in stealth tech, quantum computing, or even theoretical time manipulation. The military's current fascination with metamaterials that bend light or cloak objects takes on new significance when viewed through this lens. Maybe the Philadelphia experiment wasn't a failure at all, just an early, brutal step toward capabilities we've since perfected behind closed doors. And that's the heart of the mystery. If there's truth here, it forces us to confront a world where the boundaries of science fiction and classified reality have blurred beyond recognition. A world where the laws of physics aren't just discovered but weaponized, and where the price of progress is paid in lives we'll never know were lost. The Philadelphia experiment's greatest legacy might not be a ship that vanished, but a question that lingers. In the pursuit of the impossible, how much of our humanity are we willing to sacrifice? Decades after the alleged Philadelphia experiment, curious minds have tried to recreate its bizarre phenomena, not in classified military labs, but in garages, college physics departments, and viral YouTube videos. The most famous attempt came in 1999, when a team of researchers at the University of Michigan rigged a miniature Eldridge inside a plasma chamber. bombarding it with electromagnetic pulses strong enough to make the air crackle with purple tendrils of ionized gas. Cameras captured something uncanny, the model ship flickering at the edges as if phasing in and out of focus. But was this true invisibility, or just an optical illusion caused by superheated air bending light? Skeptics pointed out the obvious. Scaling this up to a 900-ton destroyer would require energy surpassing modern power grids. Still, the footage sparked a frenzy, with amateur experimenters worldwide jury-rigging Tesla coils and microwave generators in their backyards, chasing that elusive green mist. The internet era turned these reenactments into spectacle. In 2015, a German YouTuber draped a fishing boat in electromagnetic coils and pulsed it with enough voltage to send his drone cameras into static, just long enough for the hull to blur eerily before the circuits fried. Comments erupted with claims of a breakthrough, but physicists quickly debunked it as camera glare mixed with wishful thinking. More telling are the controlled studies, like the 2021 MIT experiment that used metamaterials to bend radar waves around a small object, achieving true invisibility to sensors but leaving it fully visible to the naked eye. The team's lead researcher dryly noted, "If the Navy had this tech in the 1940s, we'd see it on every stealth fighter today. Then there are the human trials or lack thereof." No ethical lab would expose subjects to the fields described in the Philadelphia Law, but historical accidents offer grim parallels. In 1998, a Russian sailor named Ivan Torsky survived an arc flash from a malfunctioning degaussing coil, later describing days of lost time and waking with his hands embedded in a metal bulkhead, an injury matching the Eldridge's fused crew. Medical scans showed his bones had briefly demineralized, allowing them to mesh with the steel like putty. Doctors chalked it up to electrolysis, but Torsky insisted he'd fallen through the ship during the incident. His case remains a haunting footnote in the debate, proof that some aspects of the myth are physically possible, just catastrophically unsafe, the sobering truth. Every attempt to replicate the experiment either fizzles into parlor tricks or veers into lethal territory. High-energy physics isn't something you can DIY in a basement without risking Chernobyl-style consequences. Yet the allure persists because these reenactments aren't really about science, they're about confronting the unknown. Each flickering plasma discharge or warped camera angle becomes a Rorschach test for belief, a fleeting glimpse into what might have been. And perhaps that's the experiment's real legacy, not proving whether a ship can vanish, but revealing how desperately we want to believe it did. The Philadelphia experiment didn't just vanish into history, it seeped into the cultural groundwater, shaping everything from UFO lore to modern distrust of government secrecy. Its fingerprints are everywhere, though you might not realize it. Take ufology, for example. Before Roswell became synonymous with alien encounters, stories like the Eldridge's disappearance primed the public to believe in impossible technologies hidden by the military. The green mist, the teleporting sailors, the whispers of time travel, these details didn't just inspire sci-fi. They became a blueprint for how we imagine advanced civilizations might operate. When whistleblowers today talk about reverse-engineered alien tech, they're echoing the same narrative framework Carl Allen spun back in the 1950s, that the government possesses world-altering secrets and the truth is stranger than fiction. But the experiment's real power lies in how it bridges conspiracy theories across decades. It's the missing link between World War II's occult rumors and today's deep state paranoia. The Nazis had Die Glocke, the Cold War had MK Ultra, now we have QAnon. Each movement borrows from the Philadelphia playbook, blending real military research with existential dread. The Eldridge's story endures because it's infinitely adaptable. In the 70s, it was proof of CIA mind control. In the 90s, it explained missing time in alien abduction accounts. Today, it's a cautionary tale about AI or quantum weapons. The details shift, but the core remains. Someone, somewhere, is playing God with forces they don't understand. Then there's the military transparency angle. The experiment became a rallying cry for activists demanding accountability, precisely because it's so hard to disprove. No amount of declassified documents can kill a myth this resilient. Every redaction just feeds the fire. When Edward Snowden revealed the NSA's mass surveillance, conspiracy theorists didn't just say, "I told you so." They asked, if the government lied about this, what else might be hidden? The Eldridge is the ultimate black swan proof that even the wildest speculation might one day be confirmed. So why does this story stick? Because it's not really about a ship. It's about the human need to believe that the world is more mysterious than it seems, and that power always has something to hide. The Philadelphia experiment is our collective campfire tale, a warning whispered across generations, reminding us that behind the official record, there's always another layer waiting to be uncovered. The story of the Philadelphia experiment isn't just a relic of wartime intrigue, it's a mirror reflecting timeless tensions between scientific progress and human ethics. Beneath the layers of conspiracy and speculation lies a cautionary tale about what happens when curiosity outpaces caution, and when the pursuit of knowledge becomes untethered from moral responsibility. Consider the alleged goals of Project Rainbow: invisibility, teleportation, perhaps even time travel. These weren't just ambitious, they were attempts to rewrite the fundamental rules of nature, driven by the desperation of war. And if the accounts hold even a sliver of truth, the cost was catastrophic. Men fused into steel, minds shattered by unreality, lives erased or rewritten without consent. The experiment's greatest failure wasn't technical, it was ethical. This dilemma echoes far beyond the 1940s. Modern science grapples with similar questions: gene editing, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, each offering world-changing potential, each carrying existential risks. The Philadelphia experiment serves as an early warning. When research operates in shadows, divorced from public oversight or ethical constraints, the line between breakthrough and atrocity blurs. Military secrecy amplifies the danger. Governments justify classified programs as necessary for national security, but history shows how easily need to know becomes a shield for recklessness. The Manhattan Project gave us atomic energy, and Hiroshima. MK Ultra sought mind control techniques and left test subjects suicidal. The same pattern repeats. Ambition justifies the means until the means haunt us. Yet the deeper lesson isn't just about secrecy, it's about accountability. The Philadelphia legend persists because it embodies our collective unease with power structures that operate beyond scrutiny. When sailors vanish or scientists die under murky circumstances, when records are lost or witnesses discredited, it erodes trust in institutions meant to serve the public. This erosion isn't hypothetical. Polls show declining faith in governments and corporations, fueled by real scandals and amplified by conspiracy culture. The Eldridge's story thrives in this climate not because it's proven, but because it resonates with an uncomfortable truth. Unchecked authority tends to prioritize control over transparency. But there's a counterpoint to the pessimism. The very fact that we debate the Philadelphia experiment signals a healthier dynamic, a society that questions, investigates, and demands answers. Whistleblowers like Carl Allen, flawed as they were, represent the impulse to expose hidden truths. Researchers who sift through declassified documents continue a tradition of holding power to account. The experiment's legacy, then, isn't just a warning, it's a call to vigilance. Scientific progress needn't be abandoned, but it must be tempered with humility, oversight, and an unwavering commitment to human dignity. Perhaps the most haunting question the story leaves us with isn't, did it happen, but could it happen again? In an era of autonomous weapons, neural implants, and AI that writes its own code, the stakes are higher than ever. The Philadelphia experiment reminds us that the future belongs not to those who ask, can we, But to those who pause to ask, should we, before we reach for the next universe-altering technology, we do well to remember the green mist, the fused bulkheads, and the whispers of men who may have glimpsed realities we're still not ready to face. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Even after decades of investigation, the Philadelphia experiment refuses to surrender its deepest secrets. The most haunting question isn't just what happened to the USS Eldridge, it's what became of the men who supposedly vanished that day. Survivor accounts describe crewmates flickering out of existence mid-sentence, their screams cutting off as if swallowed by the air itself. Navy muster rolls from 1943 show curious gaps. Sailors listed as transferred or hospitalized with no further details, their service records abruptly ending like pages torn from a book. Families of some crewmen received telegrams stating their loved ones were lost in the line of duty, yet no graves or remains were ever returned. The most chilling case involves a seaman named James Preston, whose sister spent years searching for answers after receiving his personal effects, including a diary with an entry dated 3 days after his official disappearance, describing the air turning to liquid and hands passing through my chest. The Navy's response, a form letter claiming clerical error. Then there's the enigma of the classified files. Despite decades of Freedom of Information Act requests, certain documents remain stubbornly redacted or missing. One 1944 Naval Research Lab report, partially declassified in 2007, contains 18 consecutive pages blacked out except for sporadic phrases, field intensity, temporal displacement, and most unnervingly, subject retrieval protocol. Why censor World War II-era research in the 21st century unless it touches on technology still deemed sensitive? Even more telling are the oddities in accessible records. A maintenance log for the Eldridge's sister ship, the USS Compton, mentions unexplained voltage spikes during degaussing tests in late 1943 with a handwritten margin note reading, same as D-173. Do not discuss. D-173 was the Eldridge's hull number, coincidence or a paper trail someone forgot to burn. But the biggest unanswered question isn't in the files, it's in the silence. Over 20 alleged witnesses, from engineers to medics, gave interviews between the 1950s and 80s describing the experiment's aftermath. Yet virtually all backed out last minute when subpoenaed for congressional hearings, citing sudden memory gaps or undisclosed threats. One Navy psychiatrist, Dr. Herbert Silverstein, broke ranks in 1986, admitting he'd treated multiple Eldridge crewmen for spatial dissociation disorder before being ordered to destroy their files. When pressed for details, he clammed up, whispering, "Some doors shouldn't be opened." His office burned down the following week, ruled an electrical fire, though firefighters noted the flames were oddly localized, as if something had targeted the records. The most unsettling possibility, we're not just being kept in the dark about the past. If the Philadelphia experiment tapped into principles of unified field theory or space-time manipulation, its implications would extend far beyond 1943. Modern physicists working on quantum entanglement and wormholes report unusual roadblocks, denied funding, confiscated notes, even whispered warnings about repeating Philadelphia. A 2019 DARPA budget briefly mentioned metamaterial cloaking before the line item vanished from subsequent reports. Meanwhile, urban explorers at closed military bases like Montauk and Wright-Patterson have filmed odd electromagnetic phenomena matching descriptions from the Eldridge witnesses. The truth may not be buried in archives. It could be unfolding right now, hidden behind layers of classification and disinformation, while the original mystery serves as both warning and distraction. What makes these unanswered questions so corrosive isn't the lack of answers. It's the pattern they form: missing documents, silenced witnesses, technologies that vanish from public discourse only to resurface decades later in unrecognizable forms. The Philadelphia experiment endures not because it offers tidy conclusions, but because it embodies our deepest suspicion. That history isn't just written by the victors sometimes, it's rewritten by them too. Every redacted page, every vanished sailor, every scientist who abruptly changes their tune whispers the same troubling thought: some truths aren't lost. They're hidden, and whatever's being protected must be valuable enough to justify 80 years of lies, or terrifying enough to require them. The USS Eldridge may have sailed out of Philadelphia's harbor decades ago, but its ghost still lingers, not just in whispered accounts or redacted files, but in the unsettling questions it forces us to confront. Think about it, even if only fragments of this story are true, we're left staring at a world where governments could bend the fabric of reality, where sailors became unwilling test subjects in experiments too horrifying to acknowledge, and where the line between science and nightmare blurred beyond recognition. The Navy's denials, the missing records, the witnesses who vanished or fell silent, they don't just suggest a cover-up. They paint a picture of a reality where some truths are deemed too dangerous to ever see the light. So where does that leave us? The Philadelphia experiment isn't just a conspiracy theory or a campfire tale. It's a litmus test for how we view power, secrecy, and the limits of human ingenuity. Every declassified document, every deathbed confession, every eerie parallel to real-world science forces a choice. Do we dismiss it all as coincidence and fabrication? Or do we dare to consider that history's darkest chapters might still have missing pages? The fact that this story refuses to die, that it morphs and adapts with each generation, tells us something profound. It's not about proving whether a ship vanished in 1943. It's about asking what else might be hiding in the shadows of official narratives. Now it's your turn. Look at the evidence or the lack of it. Weigh the eyewitness accounts against the Navy's flat denials. Consider the science that could explain the horrors and the gaps no declassified file has ever filled. Then ask yourself, what do you believe happened aboard the Eldridge that day? Was it a tragic accident wrapped in myth, a suppressed breakthrough that rewrote physics? Or something else, something we still don't have the vocabulary to describe? The truth might be out there, or it might be lost to time, but the conversation isn't over. Share your theories in the comments, pass this video to someone who loves a good mystery, and keep questioning. Because sometimes the most important discoveries start with a single, unsettling question. What if they're not telling us everything?